Man United's worst finish in the Premier League era was 7th place in the 2013-14 season under David Moyes. However, earlier this year, they would set a new record when they would finish 8th in the 2023-24 season under Erik Ten Hag. As of the making of this video, currently in the 24-25 season, after 9 matches throughout roughly 25% of the season, Man United currently sits at 14th place, standing dangerously close to relegation. It's gotten so bad that of any manager since Sir Alex Ferguson, United are at their most ridiculed, memed, and disrespected by opposing fans everywhere. Some people are trolling, but at the same time completely serious when they hope that Erik Ten Hag would stay on much longer as United manager because they were such an easy win. There's even a video where other Premier League managers share their thoughts on Erik Ten Hag's sacking, calling it a big disappointment. And people in the comments are speculating that Pep Guardiola is trolling and being sarcastic. But early on, there were so many articles and videos talking about how Erik Ten Hag is a visionary, a tactical genius, or how he'll create a revolution for Man United. They had so much faith in a guy that had yet to prove himself in any one of Europe's top 5 leagues, so much to the point that they would even give him unlimited funding, and I never understood why. For reference, in the 2.5 years that Jose Mourinho managed United, he spent around 400 million euros. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer in 3 years would spend around 460 million euros. But Erik Ten Hag in just 2 years would knock them both out of the water, spending an insane 858 million euros, only to record disastrously new lows for the club. But some will argue Erik Ten Hag had won United their first trophy in years. And while that may be true, in the words of Man United fans themselves, guess we should accept being a bottom half mid-table team, all because we scrapped an FA Cup win last season. The chokehold that Erik Ten Hag had on Man United is truly baffling. It's almost like witnessing a toxic relationship, as he consistently gaslighted the world into thinking he's done a good job. Like this other fan says, despite the consistently poor performances over a large sample size like the league, just because he won the Carabao and FA Cup, some people were genuinely willing to wait several more years for him to turn things around. There are even some United fans that genuinely believe signing Antony, letting go of De Gea, and buying players like Onana and Mount weren't his decision. Don't forget, this is the same manager that gaslit the entire world into thinking that Cristiano Ronaldo was crazy when he said that Erik Ten Hag had no respect, despite a recent article coming into light that Ten Hag did not allow Ronaldo to even enter the dressing room to collect his boots, or the fact that he made Jadon Sancho eat, train, and change on his own, isolating him unless he publicly apologized, with sources saying that some players viewed it as unnecessary humiliation. But back then, don't forget, the world and the media were siding with Erik Ten Hag. And there are still many who criticize the United players for the club's performance, not the manager. And to an extent, that might be true. But when you see stories like this recently coming to light about how he's treated his players, well, it only makes sense that they wouldn't exactly do their very best to fight for their manager. So just how did Erik Ten Hag convince the world that he was a good manager? Well, it mainly goes back to his time at Ajax. On the surface, Erik Ten Hag's tenure at Ajax seems rather successful. A classic underdog story of a coach who led a young team to prominence. But if you look at things through a deeper context, Erik Ten Hag basically inherited a lot of talent, more akin to riding a wave built by Ajax's exceptional youth program, rather than his own tactical genius. When Ten Hag first took charge at Ajax, players like Matthias de Ligt, Frankie de Jong, and Hakim Ziyech were already developing into stars. In this context, Ten Hag's achievements feel less like a masterclass and more like the inevitable results of a ready-made team. For example, Ajax's 2019 Champions League run, often considered as a highlight of Ten Hag's accomplishments, might be better described as a lightning-in-a-bottle moment. The team was full of raw talent and youthful audacity. That team was very young and very ambitious. From their attacking, work rate, and pressing, they were making a pretty big run in the Champions League. And of course, when they would knock out Cristiano Ronaldo and his newly joined Juventus, people were hailing Ten Hag as a tactical genius. But when Ajax faced a younger team who could take them on physically, which was exactly the case against Tottenham in the semi-finals, Ten Hag's tactical limitations showed. The tactical ability was almost non-existent, as it felt like they were just trying to keep on doing the same thing. And of course, the more experienced and better coach Tottenham would go on to advance. Because if you're up 2-0 and the opposition suddenly starts to do things differently, and as the manager, you can do nothing to adapt but watch them score 3 goals and mount a comeback, that's pretty glaring evidence of a tactical short sight. But when you look at his domestic record, well, things seem much more inflated. You have to remember, Eredivisie is a league where Ajax's dominance is expected. I mean, in the last decade since Ten Hag was in charge of Ajax, there were only 3 Dutch clubs to be crowned champions. Feyenoord won 1, PSV won 3, and Ajax won 6. With superior resources, infrastructure, players, and budget, Ajax greatly outpaces its Dutch competitors, diluting his league titles to less of coaching acumen and more like a natural advantage. And I'm not trying to take shots at the Eredivisie, but majority of the other clubs are just at a lower level. And I'm sure many can agree that their opposition's lower pace and less structured defense allows Ajax's talent to shine without needing any complex tactical guidance, like we've seen with some players. In fact, you can argue that Portugal's Primeira Liga is much more competitive and might require more tactical acumen to get the edge over the opposition. In the end, Ten Hag's time at Ajax was less about tactical prowess and more about fortunate timing. He was more like a custodian of an exceptional generation, a team that would have more or less done the same regardless of the manager. You could also argue that one of the Eredivisie's strongest clubs of that decade, PSV, were in rather poor form, performing lower than they typically would with talent less than they usually had. But the success he had in the Netherlands, plus the talent that he had at his disposal which outshined everyone else, people started to look at him like he was some sort of tactical genius. And this brings me to Ten Hag's tactical failures and his rigid, predictable, and unadaptive system. I know many of you know, when it was announced that Ten Hag would become United's manager, he was getting hyped up a lot more than, say, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, and much more than their newly appointed manager, Ruben Amorim. Like I mentioned in the Champions League, when he was up 2-0, instead of parking the bus against Tottenham when they were up, he would continue a very aggressive attacking style. Ten Hag really does rely on individual brilliance, and at United he's basically guilty of that as well, especially with his over-reliance on Bruno Fernandes and Marcus Rashford. His attacking style also lacks any real creativity, consistently relying on the same predictable movements that leaves his team susceptible to the counterattack. And one thing I never really understood was his obsession with high pressing. I know, in modern game, pressing is incredibly important, but more often than not, in Ten Hag's formations, pressing leads to more bad than good, especially with the disconnect between the midfield and defensive positioning. And when you rely on guys like Casemiro and Eriksen, who aren't getting any younger, to consistently move up and press, well, as soon as the opposition breaks that, they're going to have an advantage on the counterattack. And some pundits believe his over-reliance on pressing is simply due to the fact that Erik Ten Hag doesn't understand the midfield cohesion that's required to control the possession and build up the attack. And yet often you see him try to compensate even more for that by forcing his defenders to play a high line. But all it takes to break that down is the opposition regaining possession and a cheekily played through ball combined with a well-timed run for United to end up conceding a goal. But I guess when his tactics are working, they're working. The only issue is when the opposition decides to switch things up, Ten Hag is more reluctant to do the same. But something that also ties into his tactics are the very questionable personnel decisions. I'm sure many of you are aware of Ten Hag's inclinations to basically sign a lot of his former players. And while some can argue he's just doing that because of the success he's had before with them, well, it also stems back to his reliance on his individual players' talent, and not so much his tactical ability. Because if you all remember that season where United finished third, tactically speaking, he really didn't do anything different. It just so happened that Marcus Rashford was coming up for a contract renewal, and he decided to absolutely ball out and get the bag. Bruno Fernandes himself was also in one of his best career forms, but the media largely blew that out of proportion and gave most of the credit to Erik Ten Hag's management. And everything else is gonna tie into his player development and personnel mismanagement. Again, from his time at Ajax, Ten Hag's track record with player development is often exaggerated, as he was far from the one that developed that young Ajax core. That's kind of like saying Guardiola was the one who developed guys like Messi, Xavi, and Iniesta. But hey, that statement is at least a lot more true than Ten Hag developing De Ligt, De Jong, and Van de Beek. And the only credit for developing young talent that I will give him is giving an opportunity to Rasmus Højlund and Kobe Mainu. But as we know, especially in hindsight, Ten Hag doesn't really have all that much of an eye for fitting players with particular systems. I mean, just take a look at his signings. Sure, we all know about how much he spent on Onana and Antony, but if you look at his other signings, they don't exactly fit a club that needs a younger talent to develop and build a new identity. In fact, it doesn't even fit the style he wants to play. Because signing older players like Casemiro, for example, is not exactly going to work all that well when you demand your players to consistently press at a high rate. And for the younger guys like Alejandro Garnacho, it took him quite a while to really give him a chance and let him fit more into the system. Plus, there's proof of Ten Hag's pride and authoritarian nature as a manager. I mean, the Ronaldo situation aside, the way he treated Jadon Sancho is just crazy. And it kind of makes you wonder if the other players are really all that keen in adapting his playstyle and accepting his mentality. I mean, do you really want to question the guy who's going to punish you with isolation and even criticize you publicly in the news? Or would you more respect a manager that says something to your face and demands an equal amount of respect? But hey, Ten Hag had a really profitable 2 years with United, and with that £17 severance package, which was more than his salary earned at Ajax. With fans, pundits, the media, and creators like myself criticizing him, at least he'll be laughing all the way to the bank.
But you will always see that there are an era can come to an end.